What about contradictions? Well, what about them? I think often we get the bar of proof or the burden of evidence quite wrong on this. And I'm making an argument that the Gospels are generally reliable. That's part of my argument. I'm also making a further argument today that I think actually the Gospels are totally reliable because they're part of a package deal with Jesus. That is, Jesus sets up the people, commissions the group of disciples who are going to teach others, and he stakes his own reputation on their success. And so I think he gives his own authority to the Gospels. But then people ask, well, what about contradictions? And I want to say, well, what about them? Because contradictions can mean more than one thing. They can be simply at a linguistic level. In the New Testament, we have in James this: you see that a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. And then in Galatians, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Well, which is it? Let's move on. Matthew, Jesus says, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. Then in Ephesians, Paul says, he, that's Jesus, is our peace, who made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing law, a wall of hostility, by abolishing the law. Now, it's a slightly different word for abolish, but that doesn't make a lot of difference. It's the sense. Let's ask the question, does God think loving the world is good? Well, you all know the famous verse, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. But then we have in 1 John chapter 2, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. It's almost like saying, you know, loving the world would be a very ungodlike thing to do. So people tend to say, in the case of Ephesians and Matthew, or Galatians and James, that's a real contradiction. But then I want to show you some more, and these are just in John's Gospel, and I think almost all in Jesus's own teaching, where what we find is, this one's not in Jesus' own teaching, this is narrative, where it says, when Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But then at the end, it says, though he, that's Jesus, had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe. Well, did they believe when they saw the signs or not? Well, what this one does, and it's within one gospel, it teaches you to think more deeply about what it means to believe. Jesus says in the temple, you know me and you know where I come from. Then, next chapter, he says, I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. Well, hang on. Do they know where he's coming from or not? Then, 5 verses later, they said there to him, therefore, where is your father? Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my father. If you knew me, you would know my father also. Well, do they know him or not? Do they know where he's from or not? And this was within a short period. Are the crowd in John 8 offspring of Abraham? Well, 8:37, I know that you're offspring of Abraham, but you're seeking to kill me. Then a couple of verses later, if you're children of Abraham, you would do the works of Abraham, but now you're seeking to kill me. So are they children of Abraham or not? He's actually saying in one place, yes, you are. In another, you're not. And of course, the reconciliation is, in one sense, they are physically descended from Abraham, but spiritually, they're not like Abraham. Now, if Jesus bear witness about himself, is his witness true? He says, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. But then, chapter 8, they say, you bear witness of yourself, your witness is not true. Jesus answered and said, even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. Does Jesus judge? You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Then next verse, yet even if I do judge. And then 10 verses later, I have much to say about you and much to judge. Did Jesus come into the world to judge the world? Chapter 12, if anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Chapter 3, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Chapter 9, Jesus said, for judgment, I came into this world. Now, this is, I mean, at one level, this is hilarious because these are deliberate contradictions which are meant to make us read and think more deeply about what the words really mean. Now, how does Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, read them? This is how he reads John's Gospel. One of my favorite apparent discrepancies, I read John for years without realizing how strange this one is, comes in Jesus's farewell discourse, the last address that Jesus delivers to his disciples at his last meal with them, which takes up all of John chapters 13 to 17 in the Gospel according to John. In John 13:36, Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" A few verses later, Thomas says, "Lord, we do not know where you're going." And then a few minutes later at the same meal, Jesus upbraids his disciples saying, "Now I am going to the one who sent me, yet none of you asked me, where are you going?" John 16 verse 5. And then he comments, either Jesus had a very short attention span or there's something strange going on with the sources for these chapters, creating an odd kind of disconnect. And that comes from a book, and you can see it on the right, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible and why we don't know about them. That's the title. Now, this is incredible because here we have an intelligent skeptic who completely misreads John's Gospel. And he just reads it and thinks this is evidence that Jesus was stupid rather than actually evidence that he's clever. In terms of they're thinking in a mundane sense, where is he next physically going to? They're not thinking about his spiritual journey and so on. So this is a great case of where actually each of these contradictions can be picked off one at a time and shown not to be anything like as compelling as often they're thought to be, and how an intelligent person can actually mistake the nature of the evidence. So I want, however, to look at the whole question of biblical, not just contradictions, but problems. When I wrote my book on the Gospels, my chapter on contradictions was just 5 pages long. It really is measly. One of the things I got a lot of feedback from, negative feedback, well, I mean, kind negative feedback, was, well, he really didn't say much there, did he? He just listed some contradictions that are deliberate within John and thought that had solved things. Well, I wasn't exactly claiming in 5 pages to try and solve everything. I was trying to write a short book. If you write a short book, don't write about things that need lots of words. So, but what I was trying to make is really quite a serious point about probability and problems and point scoring. I think often we try and score points. The Christian says, there are no problems. Well, there are problems. God put some problems there. Why can't he put problems there? Crosswords are problems. They're deliberately put there by people on newspapers. God is allowed to put problems in his book. That's fine, he's allowed to put puzzles there for people. That's fine as well. And in fact, he can structure the Bible so that the more you seek, the more evidence you find. And my testimony as I've been investigating the Bible is the more I seek, I think the more evidence I find. Now, people might say, well, that's called confirmation bias. I'd say there's also stuff that I think I can share with people that looks pretty objective and discussable. It's not, it's the sort of thing we can have an argument about. But also the Bible could be written such that the more you doubt, the easier doubt will become, and the more confirmation of your doubts you could find. That's the way things are morally structured, because right at the center, there is a moral decision as you encounter the person of Jesus of Nazareth about, I think there's a call that you have to follow him and give up everything to do that. And that is, rejecting that is a moral decision. Now, I want to look a bit at probabilities. Imagine we have 4 problems with the Bible. Problem 1, 2, 3, 4. I've given them columns there on the screen. And let's call the blue bit your preferred solution. So you've got a solution that gets rid of the problem, and the red is every other possibility. Now, people might be happy with problem 1 because we've got a solution and it's pretty good. And in our judgment, that solution has got a sort of probability of just under 70%. It's okay. Problem 2, you're a bit worried. It's only just over the line. Not much margin there. Problem 3, you're quite worried because it looks more likely than not that your preferred solution won't work. And problem 4, it really is looking pretty improbable that your solution will work. That's often the way people treat biblical problems, and I think it's entirely wrong, because actually, in terms of solving problems, it could be more like this. I actually don't need to have a preferred solution to a problem. When someone comes up with a problem to me, like, what about Quirinius's census or something like that? What's the problem? I don't need to have one specific model, because there's all of the possibilities and all of the things we don't know and we do know that can be thrown in there. I might have a preferred solution, and that preferred solution might be quite a minority probability, small probability, but actually there are lots of other possibilities that might also work. And if you add up all of those, they take up quite a bit of all of the likely scenarios. And so that's actually fine. But also, as someone who is basically someone who goes for the entire truthfulness of Scripture, and I can qualify that. I mean, I'm talking about God doesn't make mistakes when he writes what he writes. I have no problem if sometimes the probability both of a preferred solution and of all other solutions seems to be below 50%. I've got no problem with that. I would just have a problem if that's happening every day, all the time, and it isn't. If it just happens occasionally, that's fine, because improbable things happen in life. That's okay. So I don't think you need to have a preferred problem, a preferred solution to problems. And some people have structured their belief system such that they go to unbelief very quickly. Someone was telling me about someone who became an atheist from a Christian in about 30 seconds because they'd come across a problem they couldn't solve and they just flipped. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. How could they do that? Evidently, they didn't have belief system structured like a spider's web, or what Americans call a spider web, because the spider's web has different nodes which are attached to all different things. So if you take one off, it's still attached by something else. And I would have thought that there are so many multiple reasons for believing in Christianity positively that you don't need to worry so much about if one thread is not looking very good. If there's one problem you can't solve, that's not a difficulty, because most of life is full of all sorts of problems you can't solve. People are working at grand unifying scientific theories with problems they can't yet solve. That doesn't mean they don't give up working on quantum mechanics the moment they can't solve something. They just keep on working on it. And that's a well-known historic Christian position that, as Augustine said, credo ut intelligam, I believe in order that I may understand, that your belief needs to be rightly grounded in the first place. But I think you've seen there is plenty of evidence for the Gospels, rational ground for believing it. And then as you go further, your understanding increases. But I want to say also the skeptics have got some things that they can't really explain. And I want to go on to that. So I want to talk a bit about this story of the prodigal son, which is Jesus's longest parable. We've looked at Jesus's shortest parable, so why not look at Jesus's longest parable as well? Because actually there's a ton of data in here that needs to be explained. People need to explain this. Skeptics need to explain this, because it's a brilliant story. And who is the brilliant storyteller? Is it Jesus, or is it someone after Jesus who credits Jesus with one of the most brilliant stories ever? Or is it a committee that makes a brilliant story? Committees don't normally make brilliant stories. And we've seen already that it's not just got the surface story, it's also got all of these references to Jacob and Esau, which are there for the experts. But there's more. You see, as we look at the prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son, we see there's actually quite a lot going on in this story, because it's not just Jacob and Esau, it's also the story of Joseph. You see, you have in the story of the prodigal son this great famine, and the phrase great famine does not occur in a lot in the Bible. And the biggest and most famous famine in the Bible are, of course, the famine at the time of Joseph. But Joseph is also the only other rags to riches, instant rags to riches story in the Bible. It's Joseph coming out of prison, and what happens is he gets this ring on his finger and the garments at great speed. And this is very clearly referred to in Jesus' story. So Jesus fills his story with stuff from Genesis in the Jacob Esau story. He also takes stuff from the Joseph story. And you notice there that the father says, quick. We'll come back to that word, quick. That's his very first word from the father. Bring the best robe and put it on him and put a ring on his finger. There's also a lovely contrast because, of course, whereas no one gave food to the prodigal, Joseph gave food to everyone. But we'll look more at that. But also more of a connection is here, that Joseph went into a far country and he was thought dead. The only other time in the Bible that someone has a son, a father has a son, they think is dead. And that's effectively what Jacob's situation was. He thought Joseph was dead. So Jesus models a brilliant story of this and also takes two of the greatest hits of Genesis and weaves them in. And of course, there's a moral point to this at the same time, because Joseph forgave his brothers. Esau forgave his brother, and the older brother in this story doesn't. And so if you're a scribe, you're not only hearing Jesus, you telling a story with references to the Old Testament that you ought to spot. Whether you do spot them, you ought to spot. You're also, if you think about them, if you meditate about them, you are being morally challenged about your own response, your own desire to kill your brothers like they did, their desires were in the Joseph story. But there's more. You see, the father is very much like Abraham. Abraham is the most archetypal father. And if you ask yourself who in the Old Testament had two sons, well, two and only two is Isaac. But two and most famously two is Abraham, who had Isaac and Ishmael. And yet there's a difference, because whereas in the prodigal son story, the man divides the wealth between the two sons, Abraham famously only gives the wealth to the younger son, to Isaac, not to Ishmael. And yet we have this thing that Abraham is the archetypal father. He's mentioned in Jesus's story in the next chapter. Abraham, it's a brilliant story. It's the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man wants Abraham to send Lazarus to talk to his 5 brothers. But if he had read the 5 books of Moses, he would know that if Abraham is his father, Abraham has loads of offspring and Lazarus is his brother. So it's just a mistake of not knowing who his brother is. And it's a brilliant story. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. The point is here, Abraham as a father is a key figure. And Abraham is also the first host. Genesis chapter 18, the first, apart from the fruit in the garden, the first recorded meal in the Bible, and Abraham hosts God. No wonder God says that Abraham can be the host of the grand heavenly banquet. But look at this. Abraham is also the only person in the Old Testament who gave away his inheritance while he's still alive. It says this: Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son eastward into a far country. You know, Abraham was the guy who would not let his son go into a far country. He would not let Isaac go to a far country. That's chapter 24. Chapter 25, he'll let all of the rest. In fact, they have to go into a far country. So Jesus winds in all of these themes from Genesis in a brilliant way. Now, there's also this, the word quick, the first word the Father says. Where does that come from? Well, we've come across this verse already today. Abraham's entertaining. What does he say to Sarah? First word, quick. And this is the first time the word quick occurs in the Bible. And it's the only time this occurs quite in this sort of context, because it's quick. 3 seahs of fine flour. Well, that's where we find Jesus's shortest parable uses that phrase. So Jesus' longest parable has the quick. And guess what they have to do quickly? They have to go and get a fatted calf in both stories. So if you're a scribe, you should be, you've copied out Genesis quite a few times before now. You should know these stories really well, and they should be firing off in your mind. And you're seeing Jesus speaking a brilliant story to them. And yet the Pharisees, the tax collectors and sinners are probably missing half of this. You might have missed some of it. But there's more. You see, Ishmael was the older brother who refused to go into the feast for his younger brother. Genesis chapter 21, verse 8. And Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, laughing. So in other words, all of this is there. And of course, the older brother Ishmael is the one who is a servant, or from a servant genealogy, and it's the older brother in the story who thinks of himself as having to slave when in fact he's not. So there are all of these things, but there's more. Here's another layer. It's the Jacob and Laban layer. I want you to notice about this, that it piles up in the second half of the story. So Jesus' story is the 62% is the prodigal going away and coming back. The 38% is what happens with the older brother towards the end. So it's a smaller bit. And what happens is in that 38% towards the end, which is mainly aimed at the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus hits the references and bangs them into there. Just about every word is taken from somewhere in the Old Testament in Genesis. And so here we have Laban. By the way, Laban lost all his stuff to Jacob, and he still was prepared to bless Jacob's children. And so again, that's another point. And so what we find is the older brother in Luke 15 saying, your son has devoured your property. Laban's daughters saying, Laban's devoured our money. Devour, the same word. The older brother hears the music and the dancing. Laban said he wanted to send his daughters away with that sort of music. The older brother becomes angry. But in the Laban story, Jacob becomes angry. The older brother says, these many years I've served you. Jacob says to Laban, these 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. The father says to the older son, all that is mine is yours. And it literally is. And of course, Laban is saying, oh, you see, it's mine. You took it. So all of these references come together. It is simply brilliant. I find it breathtaking that such a simple story that you can tell a young child and it works can also have all this depth in. Now, how does this come about? Does it come about by a committee in the early church? Or because some of it is from Jesus, some of the words are from Jesus, and some of the words come from Luke and someone later? Does that really explain it? No, it's got to come from one mind who is absolutely steeped in the Old Testament. That's the simple explanation. And I can't think of any other decent explanation. That is that the whole lot comes from Jesus. I'm staking out for these words come from Jesus. I don't want this committee. It's not a committee that produced this parable. And this is the challenge to us, that actually people want to sort of sit on the edge and say, well, I'm going to have partial gospel reliability. I'm going to have a bit of it. But actually, there's a whole package here. So what do I conclude? Jesus knows the Old Testament really well. Understatement. Basically, it works because Jesus is the author of Genesis. That's how you can take the greatest hits in all of the patriarchal narratives, every single one. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. You take them all together and you get all of their main themes and you get them into one 388-word story. It's just, for me, it's phenomenal. I want to pause and worship God, praise God, that he has written literature so good that Genesis, that was clearly written before Luke, can somehow be pre-formed to provide the pre-designed to provide the perfect material for this short, coherent story. To me, that is part of what's going on. It's an evidence of design, and it also shows that the parable's been handed down with integrity. You can't say, well, a bit of it is authentic and a little bit later. That doesn't have the explanatory power. So what has the explanatory power? Well, I'd want to say there's one simple, overarching explanation for what's going on, and it's this. the beginning of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And as it goes on, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's a very big claim, bold claim, that Jesus is God made flesh, God incarnate. But that, I think, is basically the claim of the earliest documents. If you accept that, everything falls into place. The manuscripts, the geography, the difficulties, the Old Testament prophecy, the attestation, the sense of how the Gospels run together, how the parables make sense, how someone could be quite so smart. Or you can run away, like the prodigal son. And, you know, he ran away and it got worse and worse. And I think people can run away from the evidence. And I think we have a world, in some sense, on the run from this evidence. People could use their God-given minds for great ingenuity. And the prodigal did this. When he ran out of money, he still had a further idea, which is that he was going to somehow get food by feeding pigs. And even when that didn't work out, he had this idea that he was going to earn his way back to the Father through as a hired servant. And I think we can go off with prodigally with our own ideas, and it just gets worse and worse. So this is where I'd like to end, really, with a challenge to us. I think there is evidence here that the Gospels are not only reliable, but also that we should be trusting them in a personal way, should be trusting the message of the Gospels, and particularly what they tell us about Jesus Christ. That, to me, is the most coherent explanation for everything that we see together.